All right, diving in today, folks, and we're tackling something pretty crucial, how depression in our, older years connects to the risk of dementia. It's fascinating, really, when you look at all these different pieces of research, and it's a topic that hits close to home for so many of us as we think about aging and our brain health, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And we're looking at it from all angles, not just the statistics, which are eye-opening on their own,
Yeah.
but also delving into the actual biology, what's happening in the brain itself. And we'll also touch on whether, feeling down later in life could actually be like an early warning sign for dementia, and how our social connections and even just our daily habits can play a role. We're aiming to equip you with, the most essential insights into this whole complex relationship.
Sounds like a plan. So, speaking of those statistics, I was struck by this finding that seniors who've experienced depression are like more than twice as likely to develop dementia. That's a pretty huge link, right?
Oh, it is. And what's really fascinating is that this connection doesn't just appear right before dementia sets in. It's not just a short-term thing. The data shows this increased risk even if the depression happened years or even decades earlier. So it's a long-term connection we're talking about.
So, it's not just a coincidence or bad luck. There's something deeper going on. And it sounds like, the more often someone goes through depression, the higher the risk gets. There was something about a dose dependent relationship, right?
Exactly. Think of it this way, right?
Yep.
Each time someone has a depressive episode, the risk of developing dementia later in life goes up by about 14%. And if the depression is severe, that increase is even more significant. So yeah, the frequency and intensity matter.
Okay, so it's not just a random occurrence. There are some serious biological processes at play here. What are some of the key things happening in the brain itself that our sources pointed to?
Well, one really important area is the hippocampus. It's the part of the brain that's crucial for forming new memories. And what we see is that in older adults who've experienced depression, the hippocampus can actually shrink. And these changes, they're very similar to what we see in Alzheimer's disease. So it's like both depression and Alzheimer's are, kind of targeting the same vital brain region.
Wow, that's a pretty direct impact on memory then. What else is going on at that biological level?
Well, another interesting finding is that people who've dealt with major depression often have higher levels of these proteins called amyloid beta. Specifically, there's this ratio called a 40F42 that gets thrown off. Basically, think of amyloid beta as these like tiny sticky clumps that could build up in the brain. And guess what? These clumps is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So it suggests that depression might actually be accelerating those changes in the brain that are linked to Alzheimer's.
So the very stuff that like accumulates in Alzheimer's brains is more present in those with depression. That's a really powerful connection.
It is. And then there's the whole issue of inflammation, right?
Yeah.
Depression can trigger this chronic ongoing inflammation in the brain, which can damage brain cells and make them way more vulnerable to, developing dementia down the line. It's almost like the brain's constantly under stress, which isn't good.
Right. And there's something in our research about blood flow too, right?
Yeah, you're right. There's definitely a link between depression and problems with blood vessels, like cardiovascular
Yeah.
issues. And that can reduce blood flow and oxygen to the brain, which increases the risk of vascular dementia, which is another common type. So, it all ties together.
It really paints a picture of how depression can be a major risk factor for dementia.
Yeah.
But our sources also hinted that it could be even more than that, right? Like, it could be an early sign of something bigger going on.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing possibility. So the question is, could late life depression sometimes be one of the first clues that dementia is starting to develop? The idea is that, as brain cells begin to deteriorate in the early stages of dementia, the areas of the brain that control our mood and emotions can be affected. So that could lead to depression, even before someone starts noticing any major memory issues.
So it's not necessarily that the depression is causing the problem. It's more like it's one of the first things we might notice as a result of something else happening in the brain. That's a subtle but important distinction, isn't it?
Exactly. And then I have to consider the human element too, right? If someone starts realizing, hey, my memory isn't what it used to be, that can understandably lead to sadness, worry, anxiety, and all of that
Hmm.
can manifest as depression.
Makes sense. So much to consider. Now, how do our social lives and, everyday habits fit into this whole puzzle?
Well, if you look at the bigger picture, depression often leads to people becoming more isolated, right? They
Mm.
withdraw, maybe they don't engage as much. And that can mean fewer opportunities for activities that really challenge the brain, like stimulating conversations, hobbies, even just, going out and being around people. And less physical activity too, which we know is protective against dementia. So it can become this like downward spiral.
Like the brain isn't getting its regular workout, right? I remember reading about cognitive reserve. How does that play into this?
Yeah, cognitive reserve is a really interesting concept. Think of it as your brain's built-in resilience, its
Yeah.
ability to bounce back and adapt. But chronic depression can chip away at this reserve over time, making the brain less able to cope with the changes that come with age and, potential neurodegeneration.
So, given all this information, what are some of the key takeaways? How should we be thinking about and addressing these issues?
Well, I think one of the most important things is recognizing that late life depression could be a really valuable early signal of dementia. And that's crucial because it means we can get people diagnosed and supported much sooner, and potentially start managing any underlying conditions earlier.
And do you think there's a chance that actually treating the depression itself could have a positive impact on, like, the long-term risk of dementia?
There's definitely reason to be hopeful about that. Early and effective treatment of depression might help by reducing that harmful inflammation we talked about and protecting the hippocampus, which could lower the risk of developing dementia later on. Now, it's important to note that our sources emphasize that, more research is definitely needed to say for sure. But as Professor Charles Marshall, one of the experts we looked at, pointed out, this could be a huge opportunity. We could potentially use late life depression as a really valuable tool for early identification and intervention.
So, to sum it all up, it's pretty clear that depression in older adults is so much more than just feeling a little down. It's really deeply connected to the risk of dementia through this complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors, right?
Absolutely. It seems to be operating in this dual way, both as a factor that could be contributing to the disease process itself and as a potential early indicator that something might be changing in the brain.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. So for our listeners out there, given everything we've discussed, what are some proactive steps that individuals and their families might want to consider when it comes to mental and cognitive well-being as we age? It really underscores the profound connection between our mental health and our brain health as we get older.
It really does. And it's something we should all be paying attention to.
Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep those brains active and engaged, folks.
Take care.